Happy New Year. Can't believe it's 2022. Appreciate everyone's participation remotely today. I think it's best that we participate in the efforts to minimize our in-person contact, at least for a little while longer. And so I really appreciate it. Anyway, we have a brief management agenda today. The first item that we have before us is the approval of the September 8th meeting summary. Do any questions on the summary? All right, I will entertain a motion for approval.
So moved.
All right, I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
All right, seconded by Beth. All those in favor of approving the meeting summary of September 8th, 2021, please signify by saying aye.
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 All opposed? Motion carries. Thank you so much. All right, the next item on the agenda is a review of the statewide 2022 transportation safety projections. David Mitchell is going to be reviewing that information for us. So I will gladly mute myself and turn this over to David.
All right, thank you. Good morning, and thank you, Madam Chair. My name is David Mitchell, and I'm here today with an action item. It's an annual review of ADOT's safety projections for the following year. These are projections that were adopted last fall. And the action item will be to, I'm going to ask for your recommendation for regional council to adopt these
Madam Chair, if I
projections.
may, David, if I may, we're having troubles with our YouTube live streaming. If you don't mind, please pause for a few minutes until we get that up and running.
Sure, certainly I can wait. I'll wait for the signal.
Thank you. Okay, Madam Chair, I think we're good now. Thank you, appreciate it.
All right, and I forgot to mention, since we're all amongst friends here, please don't be offended if I use first names. So we're gonna go with it. Everybody good with that? Okay, awesome. David, proceed.
Thank you. Very good. Before we dive into the ADOT projections, PAG likes to take an opportunity just to review the PAG visions and goals, things that we have in our policy documents, as well as any plan documents that we have that are related to safety, so we can just remind ourselves of our position and direction moving forward. In our strategic safety plan, we have a vision to work towards zero deaths on our roadways to get everybody home alive. In the same plan, we also have a numerical number for reducing those towards zero. Every time we introduce our new transportation improvement program, we want to have an impact to reduce our fatalities by 7 to 10%. So this is something that never expires. It's kind of the going practice to always drive those fatalities downward to ultimately reach our 2045 goal, and that is to eliminate all roadway fatalities. In our map, our long-range plan, we have adopted some safety targets. These are where we aspire to be in 2045 based on the values that we had back in 2014 and 2015. From those early numbers, we want to see significant reductions in fatalities and serious injuries on the public roadways. 25% reductions in those numbers, as well as a 45% reduction in the rates of those numbers. Rates are related to vehicle miles traveled on the network. And we even dive further into that and want to see even a greater impact in the reduction of fatalities for pedestrians and cyclists on the network. And we have significant reductions as our goals, as you see on the screen, of 33% and then 70% for the rates. The rates for pedestrian and cyclists are based on ACS commuter data, based on commute trips to work. So now let's go take a look at what ADOT is projecting for the state, and then we'll describe how PAG uses as a tool to evaluate our performance. But ultimately, I'm going to ask for the action item is to adopt or to recommend adoption of these statewide projections. As a review, this is a federal program initiated by MAP 21 and carried through with FAST Act. Since 2018, ADOT has been establishing projections for safety as well as a few other performance measures categories. Today is only related to safety. And the way that PAG participates, it's in the NPO requirement by the federal program to participate. And the way that we do is by adopting the state projections. As a note, projections are used because these are FAST Act projections and they represent statewide performance. They don't specifically call the data for the PAG region, although PAG is included in all of the data that ADOT uses in their methodology to develop the projections. As a clarification, our MAP targets are different. They are regionally adopted. These are goals and aspirations that we have set for our long-term success and performance of our region. Again, the ADOT uses the projections and they base it on a 5-year historical data to project outward for next year and the following year. Their methodology, the state program requires a 2-year projection out. So ADOT uses these, and PAG has found a way to use them as a tool just for evaluation purposes of where we stand versus where we need to be. And we'll dive into that in just a moment. So these are the projections. There are 5 performance measures. The number of fatalities and fatality rate. Unfortunately, the state continues to see the national trend applying to our state as well, to continue to see an increase in those deaths on our roadways. The way the methodology is used is they applied this increase to the current available data. So they'd be using 2020 data to project 2021 actuals and then use that to project 2022 estimates. I said actuals, but I meant estimates. So these are all just estimates based on the 5-year historical data as well as traffic counts and other data. Their fatality rate is using VMT that's calculated based on vehicle counts. So we see an unfortunate continued increase in those figures for statewide performance. We are seeing statewide projections to decrease in the next 3 performance measures. These are the serious injuries, the serious injury rate, and the last category is the non-motorized. That's the pedestrian and bicyclists on our network.
David, can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
The increases and decreases, are those rates based on population, or are they just going up because we have more people in the state in general?
Both, actually. The total numbers, those are usually attributed to the population growth. There's a lot more data that goes into it, but that's a primary driver of it is population. Honestly, if you've got 1 million people versus 100 people, you would expect to see more fatalities in a region where there was more people.
So how do those rates compare to our population increase? Are they better than, like if our population went up by 5% and our number of fatalities only by 2%, is that actually an overall improvement did they do that kind of analysis? I'm just curious.
They may have that, but it's not part of this program. And I'm sorry, I don't have that data available for the PAG region, but to explain a little bit more about fatality rate, that one is using the VMT, and that's so that as the more population that is on the roadways, you'll expect to see more vehicle miles traveled as well. But there are a lot of things that factor into the vehicle miles traveled, such as the COVID shutdown had an impact, and a few other things in the economy. Fuel prices may drive that up and down historically. Perhaps the graphs on the next 5 slides will help answer, or at least give you a better picture. We all know that the population of Pima County is steadily growing. We can take a look at how the PAG region is performing over the last 5 years or so. We aspire to see that to go down. But let's go ahead and take a look into the data, and maybe we can get better question discussion out of that. Something has. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't have that information available. It was in a previous slide. But what I can tell you is that we are, as a region, we are not working to where we need to be in the terms of fatalities, fatality rates, serious injuries. We are continuing to see a increase in those as well. And we're not on pace in some of them to reach our 2045 projections.
Okay, thank you.
And so if there are no other questions, that brings my presentation to a closure. The ask is for a recommendation for Regional Council to adopt the 2022 ADOT safety projections.
Okay, great. I'll open the floor for any questions or comments from members of the management committee. Carmine?
Madam Chair and David or Farhad, just so that we're all clear, these projections are based on 5-year averages. So really it's formulaic in how that's put together. The direction, David, I think that you were going was going to dive a little bit into the data in terms of the goals that we've established here in the region for reductions in fatalities going forward. And I think if that could be an item brought back just for presentation to the management committee at a future meeting, that would be helpful. So as I understand, we're just adopting these projections based on the formula of the 5-year average.
Yes, that is correct. And you were correct on all points there. Yes, PAG has a process for evaluating and pursuing aspirational goals. The ADOT program is more of a projection based on the 5-year historical data. The federal programs are requiring that we have actual data used in these methodologies as well as realistic outcomes. The state has to go through a process and reporting process for these, and will be evaluated on such and assessed.
If I may add to that, Madam Chair, as David mentioned, our goals are established in the RMAP process. And as you all know, we're beginning the update to the next RMAP process. So as part of that process, we can reevaluate our goals and obviously include measures to continue to hopefully achieve those goals through the RMAP process. And this is a more of a reality check through the state analysis and making sure that we meet the federal requirements. So there are really two separate things, but from our perspective, the goals are much more important to us, and being able to have the measures in place to achieve those goals, which is an ongoing effort.
Great, thanks Farhad. Robin?
I just wanted to add to what Carmine said. While I appreciate the RMAP process, and I realize we are doing a lot to start to achieve our goals, which obviously is not this item specifically, I would like an item brought to this group at some point to talk very specifically about what exactly it is we are doing in this region to get to our goals.
Okay. Farhad, can you make a note of that, and we can add that for a future discussion item?
Sure, of course.
Great, thank you. Any other questions or comments from the members of the committee? Okay, great. Well, I will entertain a motion to recommend adoption of the ADOT statewide 2022 transportation safety projections to the PAG board.
So moved.
All right. Did we capture the who made the motion?
I think that beat Carmine out by a second.
Okay, Carmine made the motion, Terry seconded. Any further questions? All right, all in favor signify by saying aye.
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 All opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, David, for your presentation.
Madam Chair.
All right. All right, our next item on the agenda is the Public Transit Human Services Coordinated Transportation Plan. And this item will be presented by Janine Sullivan. So Janine, I'll turn the floor over to you.
Okay, good morning. Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. As stated, today we're going to be reviewing the fiscal year 2023 through 2026 Public Transit Human Services Coordinated Transportation Plan. And at the end of this presentation, we're going to ask the committee to recommend adoption of and so we're going to go ahead and get started. We're going to go ahead and move to slide 2 on your screen, and we're going to begin with the plan overview to kind of give you a good high-level view of what the plan is intended to do and kind of the road ahead for that. So with the plan overview, the PAG Public Transit Human Services Coordination Transportation Plan is essentially a federally required plan for the PAG region. And it identifies the transportation needs of individuals with disabilities, seniors, and people with low incomes. And so it also provides strategies for meeting those local needs and prioritizes transportation services. So when you think about that, the primary purpose of the coordinated transportation plan is to provide guidance. And so that guidance is on the use of federal section 5310 grant funds in the region. And just so for context, Section 5310 program provides capital grants and operating assistance to nonprofits, public agencies in acquiring and operating vehicles to transport older adults and persons with disabilities. So when we look at this plan update, it's going to include for the most part, the following key elements. And so the first key element would be identification of transportation resources and evaluating specific needs and assessments, proposing strategies to bridge any regional gaps. It prioritizes collaboration efforts to solve regional challenges. And then, of course, it identifies priorities for implementing or other implementation of FTA Section 5310 funded projects. And so that is kind of a high level view of the plan. And we're going to move to the next slide. And in the next slide, we're going to kind of walk through a little bit of the plan development to give you some context of how the plan was developed. So on this particular slide, you'll kind of see that there's roughly 8 bullet points, I think. I'm not going to read the bullet points to you per se, but I'm going to kind of try to give you some context for what each of those bullet points represent. And so in the development of the plan, we worked with the Mobility Coordination Working Group, and we looked back at the meetings that were held over the course of 2020 and 2021. And for context, those working group meetings are held quarterly. They usually have about 15 to 18 transportation providers who gather together and exchange information. We work on different initiatives to implementing coordination strategies that are outlined in the coordinated plan. And so each meeting is open to the public, and it includes an agenda, topics for discussion. So if we were to kind of look back at all the discussions over the last couple of years, some of the topics that we've kind of tackled lied in a variety of different buckets. So from fleet forecasting and vehicle utilization. So that's helping agencies understand fleet life cycles, how to better utilize those vehicles or increase vehicle utilization. And then just different internal useful benchmarks. We looked at preventive maintenance and cost tracking, preparing, of course, for additional grant cycles. And then we talked about service area boundary maps. And service area boundary maps were, a key piece in terms of really trying to identify opportunities for coordination. Where are we overlapping in service areas, and where are there potentially some gaps or a need to coordinate more fully? We also looked at understanding how agencies serve or how different programs serve within our region with regard to 5310, and that's for programs both serving in rural and urbanized areas. And also, how do specific programs really serve at-risk populations? And so we looked at elements like that through our discussions and try to figure out ways to better understand that information. And then other elements we looked at were specific to vehicle inventory, driver safety training, such as PASS training, which is passenger assistance safety training, different needs or gaps that we're seeing unfold within the region. And examples of that would be like access to healthcare, employment, training initiatives, accessibility of service, different types of eligibility requirements and scheduling, and even elements with regard to technology, again, safety and availability of resources. And given what has unfolded with COVID-19, it was also important to try to understand how COVID-19 has impacted these different agencies and their ability to serve throughout the region. And so we also, within that, looked at different elements for evaluating transportation for elderly and disabled populations. And through those discussions and those meetings, we looked at elements with relationship to accessibility, mobility considerations, basic skills, functional considerations, et cetera, to include ADA eligibility and a host of other topics within that context. We also took a look at what we perceive to be some of the regional priorities that we should discuss more fully, such as night and weekend service, other elements related to special needs transportation, and then different short and long-term goals. And then of course, 5310 funding priorities. So that kind of gives you a lens of the different discussions that we've had over the course of the 2 years within the mobility coordination working group meeting. So the next element you'll see is on your slide is the 5310 Human Services Providers and Related Agencies Survey. And so we worked with the different providers and we asked them to participate in a survey. And the goal of the survey was really to better understand the scope and breadth of the programs relative to the transportation that they provide in our region. So essentially 13 agencies were surveyed, including those that were funded by FTA Section 5310 funds, and then other participating agencies such as PEMA Council on Aging. And so as you might know, PEMA Council on Aging is the administrator for about 19 volunteer-based driver programs within their 20 or so Neighbor Care Alliance programs. And so when we surveyed these different agencies, among them was the city of Tucson and the town of Oro Valley. And through those surveys, the agencies were essentially asked a variety of questions. And those questions helped us to better understand a variety of things. And some of those things are like the percent of programs that have a primary focus on a specific population, the number of agencies that have a program serving a specific geographic area, and that helps us understand urban versus rural according to a very specific program type. We looked at the percent of programs offering specifically client-based transportation services, meaning transportation services that are not open to the general public. You have to be a client of that particular nonprofit agency. And then, of course, opportunities for coordination with other 5310 funded agencies or public transit providers. We looked at the coordination of client-based and non-client riders. So what is kind of the potential for a client-based transportation provider to extend transportation services to seniors or disabled populations for, from other social service agencies or the general public that has non-client riders. And so obviously within that context, we were saying that, some priorities would be given on how that type of coordination would come about. But we did also look at primary and secondary trip purposes. And so to give you some context for that, we were asking agencies if you had a focus, meaning your primary trip purpose is to a healthcare organization, but then following that, make a secondary trip somewhere else, where would that secondary trip go to, and what category would fall into? So we are trying to understand primary and secondary trip purposes of the transportation provisions from these different agencies. So the next bullet that you'll see is for service area boundary maps. And so one of our goals within this was to better understand all the different service area boundaries for the different providers within 10 programs, but also for the volunteer-based driver programs such as Neighbors Care Alliance through PCOA. And so we also wanted to extend that a little bit further and better understand not only public transportation providers, but also NEMT, Disabled American Veterans, and the VA. So collectively, we had about 49 agencies that we did service area boundary mapping for in the PAG region. This included about 13 human service transportation providers that are active in our 5310 program, 2 public paratransit providers within 5310, 8 non-emergency medical transportation providers, 15 Neighbors Care Alliance volunteer driver programs, and then 2 programs that are through Neighbors Care Alliance, but they operate more from a support service. They're not necessarily doing transportation services. So that might mean an example that would be like they do visits for people that are homebound, but they're not necessarily providing transportation services. We also did the boundary maps for 3 different food banks that are providing delivery of food, especially during this time of COVID, to eligible individuals. And then we did the mapping for 6 private transportation providers. So examples of that would be taxis, chauffeurs, or shuttles. And then we also did the mapping for veteran transportation, so the VA, Veterans Administration Transportation Program, and the DAV. And so basically through a lot of phone calls to over 50 plus organizations, we developed these service area boundary maps via ArcGIS. And these maps are really going to play a pivotal role in not only identifying some core opportunities for advancing coordination among the 5310 providers and volunteer-based transportation organization, but also potential integration for more support for disabled veterans. But also it's going to help us identify key opportunities for expansion of services and providing referrals. So that's kind of the makeup of the service area boundary maps, but we did have a variety of objectives that are linked to those maps, and of course the survey. And so when we put those pieces together, some of this is a little bit of a reiteration, but we really wanted to kind of look at, what is the populations that are served relative to agencies' programs? What is the footprint of those transportation services being provided relative to urban and rural areas? And identifying opportunities for coordination, of course, to include public paratransit. We wanted to better understand critical opportunities for volunteer transportation services, different types of driver training and other resources, and of course, how to best support agencies with like performance monitoring, preventative maintenance, and of course, the reduction of fleet maintenance and operational costs. And then the last piece would be just what are the emerging needs and things that we might not be acutely aware of with regard to special needs populations. So the next bullet that you'll see there is about previous surveys and other regional plans. So in developing this plan, we thought it was really important to include a lot of the meaningful information and value-added elements that live and breathe in other existing plans. And so we utilized the City of Tucson's 5-year strategic plan, fiscal year 2018 regional transit marking plan from Sunvan's ridership, the long range regional transit plan or the transit choices report, the short range transit plan, and then the 2045 regional mobility and accessibility map or plan known as the RMAP. We looked at the 2012 PAG rider survey, and then of course, the 2015 and 16 community needs assessment survey. So those are a snapshot of the different plans and surveys, et cetera, that were used in conjunction with the things that I had kind of outlined a moment ago. The next part that you'll see on this slide is about assessments of needs and gaps and challenges. And so some of these I've kind of talked about a little bit, but we're going to take a deeper dive in the slides that follow. So I'm going to keep these relatively brief because we're going to kind of tackle them a little bit more fully in the slides ahead. So for assessments, needs, and gaps or challenges, basically the assessments, if you will, that we did were broken into a variety of categories. And we looked at transit needs, special needs transportation, client-based transportation, volunteer-based transportation, and then of course, veteran transportation support. The next element that you'll see on the slide is the determination of regional goals and strategies. And again, we're going to talk about this a little bit more fully in the upcoming slides. But basically for regional goals and strategies, we took kind of a high level overview of the regional needs that were described throughout the plan. And to give you some framework or context for this, these elements were broken down into like goals, objectives, and strategies, and of course priorities. And all of this is linked to advancing regional coordination. But you'll find that these opportunities, if you will, are outlined in relationship to a variety of categories. And these categories include transportation services, accessibility and rider support, transportation costs, fleet management, training, and then of course transportation gaps. So those kind of give you the main categories, if you will, for the different types of assessments that were done throughout this plan. And then once we had a good understanding of where we stood with regard to those assessments and understanding needs and gaps and challenges, we were in a better posture to really hone in on what are our regional goals and what are our strategies. And then of course, begin to prioritize those strategies for our region. So that's kind of where we're headed in the next few slides. So we're going to go ahead and move to then the next slide because we'll talk about the remainder of those bullet points more fully in the next few slides. So like I was saying before, with regard to prioritization of goals and strategies, we had that framework that I spoke to earlier in place. And so our next step was to set our goals and our priorities. So basically what we did at this point was we asked the mobility coordination working group and the transit working group to essentially rank the priority for each of the strategies and associated coordination efforts aligned with the regional goals. And so the regional goals were categorized into the following. And so we had a category for new and expanded services to meet identified gaps in rural areas. And then we had new and expanded services to meet identified gaps in urbanized areas. We had support for transportation services, cost containment practices, maintaining assets in a state of good repair, coordination of non-client rider groups, and then information resources. And that includes travel training for transportation services, just to give you kind of an example there for information resources. So we're going to the next slide in the interest of continuity and time. When we were, are we on the next slide? I couldn't tell. Yes, we're on the next slide. Okay, perfect. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, so we're on regional goals and strategy highlights. And when we're looking at this particular section, this is to give you some context for how should I say this better? This is to give you some context for what was represented in those priorities that I mentioned just a moment ago. So when we were looking at overarching regional goals and strategies for a region, like I mentioned before, when we were talking about our priorities, some of these were coordination with public transit, both rural and urban, expanding service hours, service stays, both in urbanized and rural areas, Again, enhancing that services training to better support the needs of the individuals that we serve throughout our region. Mobile maintenance offerings and to include after-hour maintenance to make sure that these vehicles are available to those that need them when they need them most. And then increasing access to healthcare or mental health care type of appointments, support for funding for preventive maintenance, regional coordination, like I mentioned before, for non-client riders. And then, of course, how do we make information and resources accessible, but especially for those that are 65 and older, because that was identified as a gap. And then we're just going to go ahead and move to the next slide. And so when we're looking at funding priorities for FTA Section 5310 funded projects, excuse me, I'm trying not to clear my throat here while I'm speaking to you. I apologize. So when we're looking at the funding priorities for the FTA Section 5310 projects, so after we had the mobility working group and the transit working group established the priority for the strategies and associated coordination efforts that were aligned with our regional goals, we felt it was imperative for the funding priorities for FTA Section 5310 funded projects to be identified. And so the framework for those priorities included a variety of things, and one of which was support for mobility management and accessibility initiatives, maintaining existing fleets in a state of good repair, addressing a regional need or gap, recruitment, training, and retention of drivers, and transportation services coordination, such as public transit, nonprofit, private, and volunteer-based. And so those actually are the funding priorities that were decided by those two groups after having had the opportunity to weigh in on those. And then as we move to the next slide for context for feedback and public comment. So like I mentioned before, the mobility coordination working group and transit working group weighed in on different elements in the development of this plan. The public comment period was for a period of 30 days, and that was from December 13th through January 11th. So it closed last night at midnight. On December 15th, the Transportation Planning Committee received a presentation on this particular plan. And then today we are asking for a recommendation for the adoption of this particular plan. And then on January 27th, is proposed that this plan will move forward to Regional Council. I will give you some additional context for the public comment period. So we did distribute via email a list of, I'm sorry, clear my throat again. So we had a list of individuals that we wanted to distribute awareness about the public comment period throughout our region too. And so within that list, we had about 80 individual organizations that are basically stakeholders, including human service providers, 120 individuals. And if we were to kind of break down how that list is separated, if you will, by program type, it's relatively equal distribution of programs that are serving seniors, low income, and disabled population. And that's just one part of the list. That list was provided basically by me to our communications team to be a part of our larger stakeholder list. But that just kind of gives you an additional snapshot of the efforts that were made to make sure that as many people had an opportunity to participate in the public comment period. So if we move to the next slide, I'm just going to open it up for questions before we lead into making a decision around recommending this plan for adoption.
Great. Thank you, Janine, for your very thorough presentation. And I just want to commend you and the PAG staff for, there's obviously a considerable amount of work that has gone into the development of this and an outreach to a great number of different organizations. And I think that's great. Any comments or questions from members of the committee? Carmine.
Madam Chair, Janine, are you able to summarize for us the public comments that were received in just rough numbers and general nature of comment that was received during that period?
Sure. I could pull it up real quick and just kind of give you a brief summary. Bear with me just one moment and I can pull that up for you. Here we go. So let's see, if I was to give you a quick ballpark estimate, a number of comments that we actually received via email through accessing our website to review the plan. I think there's around 10 comments. So to give you some context for like feedback or questions, if you will, that were presented, I think there was one, just a question about public, and let me see, I don't want to read it verbatim, but there were some comments basically about, or questions rather, about transportation out in I think the Vail area. There were some questions with regard to, opportunities for paratransit vehicles to perhaps have a dedicated lane, much like some buses have, perhaps in other cities. I don't have all of the context for that because it's a relatively lengthy paragraph and I don't want to take up too much time on that. But and then other questions were about maybe like shade at bus stops. Some folks had some questions about Uber and Lyft accessibility. Let's see.
In your view, Janine, anything that was contrary to the goals in the plan or concerning that we need to be made aware of?
I didn't see anything that really stood out as contrary or that we really would need to take a closer look at. I think the only one that just made me take pause just for a moment. And again, that was for just making sure I understood the context, was the question about, is there the opportunity for paratransit vehicles to use a dedicated lane? But I feel like that might be outside of the scope of this plan. So that's why I didn't say that I felt like it needed.
So Madam Chair, if I may, so typically after the comment period closes, we do respond to every person that submitted a comment. So we'll have a detailed review and response to each person that submitted their comments. And as Janine mentioned, we have not seen anything that's significant to make any changes at this point. But obviously we take those comments into consideration, and if they apply to any other planning effort, we direct it to that effort instead of this effort.
Madam Chair, and that was the reason for my interest in the comments, was whether any of them would warrant changes in the plan prior to our recommending its approval. So I'm satisfied with the information received. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carmine. Thanks for your response, Janine. Any other discussion or questions for Janine?
I think Robin has a question.
All right. Robin, I see your hand raised, but I just want to clarify for me as the chair, whether you are the Tucson representative or Tim is the Tucson representative.
Tim is the Tucson representative, and we typically have 2 attendees. So I'm just here as an attendee to ask questions and be informed. Just 2 quick questions. This wasn't part of the materials, this slideshow, so I'd really like to retain it. I also noticed that there's a link in the materials to the draft plan, and wondered along the lines of what you and Mr. Demonis are asking, if in that plan, are there the comments and the responses, or is that not included in the plan?
So, Madam Chair, the comment period just closed yesterday, as Janine mentioned. We will have a final tally of the comments and the responses for regional council's review. And obviously that additional information would be provided at that time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Robin. Okay, and I think we all heard Janine say that there were about 10. So I mean, given I think that speaks well to the outreach that has been undertaken with the stakeholders. And so for my part, I certainly appreciate that. And thank you for the clarification that each one of those commenters will receive a response back. Okay, any other discussion? All right, well, not hearing any, I will entertain a motion to recommend adoption of the FY 23-26 Public Transit Human Services Coordinated Transportation Plan to the PAG Regional Council.
So moved.
All right, motion made by Tim. Do I hear a second?
Second.
All right, Beth seconded that. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 All those opposed? All right, the ayes carry and the item has been recommended to the board. I will entertain a motion to adjourn this management committee.
So moved.
All right, motion made by Terry, second.
Second.
Seconded by Beth. All those in favor of adjourning this meeting signify by saying aye.
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 Aye. All right, the ayes have it. We are adjourned. And I graciously turn the lead over to.
Madam Chair, if I may, thank you. You all been very efficient, and we have an extra about 10 minutes or so. If you don't mind, let's take a break. We obviously want to wait for other TMC members to join the meeting as well. And typically they call in closer to 9:30 for that meeting. So if you don't mind, let's take a 10-minute pause, and you can all stay on the same link until we get the additional members to join us as well. And then we'll plan on getting started hopefully shortly before 9:30. Before we start and go live for our broadcasting, we want to confirm that we do have a quorum. Unfortunately, our chair and vice chair are not here. So once we open the meeting, we can address how we want to handle that. So for that purpose, I think we're ready to broadcast. Are we ready to broadcast? Okay. All right, we'll get started here in a minute. Go ahead. Yep. Okay, good morning again, and thank you all for joining the meeting today. Before we get started and call the meeting to order, we do have a procedural discussion to address. Unfortunately, our chair and our vice chair are not here with us today. Typically, from a procedural perspective, we would request among the members that are present today that one of the members would hopefully lead us into chairing the meeting today. My recommendation is to have Mary Jacobs as our chair of the management committee to also chair this meeting as well. And hopefully with your consensus, we can do that. And if anybody has any questions, we'll be happy to answer your questions. But Madam Chair, are you willing and interested to chair? And if you are, I assume we have consensus.
Gladly do it, as long as Tim conveys to Mike, thanks so much. How about that, Tim?
I will gladly carry on your message.
Any objection to me chairing from anyone on the committee? Because if anyone else wants to volunteer, I am happy to turn it over to you. Nobody else is jumping in. All right. I'm happy to chair this one as well. So let's call the meeting to order. And Farhad, if I may, would you, just because on a Zoom meeting, sometimes it's very difficult to tell, is there anyone present? Who are the official representatives? Would you just identify the official representatives from all of the agencies who are on this call for today's meeting?
I'll be happy to, and Jackie's going to hand me over the sheet. I don't have the monitor in front of me.
Since we don't do an official roll call.
Sure, of course. So again, in the spirit of staying consistent with what we just discussed, Mr. Huckleberry is the official representative for the county. Unfortunately, as you all know, he is unable to attend. Carmine is the second representative, official representative from Pima County. He's with us today. On the city side, Mr. Ortega is the official representative, in addition to a second representative from city typically. So today we have both Tim and Robin as the two alternatives for the city. On Oro Valley, Mary Jacobs, we have Miranda Terry Rosama. From Sahuarita, we have Beth as our official representative. And from ADOT, we have Rod Lane. Unfortunately, today we do not have any representatives from South Tucson, nor from Tohono O'odham Nation and Pasquayaki Tribe. Those three are absent today as well. You do have a quorum. The quorum requirement has been met. And you also have non-jurisdictional members that are with us today. And those are Mr. John Bernal, Jim Shane, Bob Anarino, Frank Thompson, and Kurt Lewick are attending as well. That's it, Madam Chair.
Yes, thank you so much. Appreciate it. All right, let's see. The first item on our agenda is the approval of the November 18th, 2021 TMC meeting summary. Are there any questions or comments on the meeting summary? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion for approval.
So moved.
All right, Jim moved, motion, who seconded?
I did, Beth.
Beth, okay, great. Motion made by Jim, seconded by Beth. Any further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
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 All opposed? All right, motion carries. Thank you. Next item on the agenda is the RTA revenue update. Jim, turn this
Okay,
over to
Madam
you.
Chair, members of the TMC, I'm going to give you an update on what we put into your packet. I did put we did distribute the PowerPoint. We have, since the PowerPoint was sent out to you, we did take a deposit. So I'll give you the latest information on the overall revenue to date. I don't have the detail yet from the Department of Revenue, so we'll update that and probably have that available for the RTA board meeting. Okay, in terms of where we stand with respect to revenues, we're very strong right now. The revenue through January to date is over $62 million. Our budget was for 53.2, and last year, by comparison, is 56. So we're 14% year-over-year growth and 17% changed budget. In terms of where we stand, this gives you kind of an idea. In the past, we've always enjoyed a very rhythmic pattern. With the pandemic, we went into arrhythmia. So we've got some differing currents that we're seeing in the economic sphere, and that's being reflected in our revenues. Fortunately, they've been favorable following the initial downturn with the stay-at-home orders. It's been very favorable ever since. We've not had a decline in year-over-year revenue since the deposit associated with April of 2020. One of the things that's really interesting to us is what's happening in the hospitality arena, most notably in the bars and restaurants. We know they got pummeled with the stay-at-home orders and with the impact of the pandemic initially, but we've seen very, very strong revenues in the restaurant and bar area. In fact, we set a record in October. Now, when I talk about October, that is the month of collections at the cash register. That is reported 2 months later. So that was what we saw deposited in our account in December, and when we looked at all of the data associated with it. We'll get an update on that that will reflect November's hospitality collections here shortly. And November has typically not been a strong month. A lot of people don't travel during the month of November except for at the holidays. And then the holiday, a lot of the holiday restaurant and bar sales are compressed at the very end of the month. So we don't see on the cycle November being a particularly strong month. October has not historically been a huge month either, but in this post-pandemic world, it certainly has been. One of the things that I do want to also point out is what's happening in contracting. We saw initially with the pandemic a whole lot of activity, a whole lot of sales closing, a lot of TPT collections for prime contracting. That has since leveled off. And one of the things that we're going to be watching is, what does that mean in terms of volume? We know that we're collecting on the cost of the sales. The sales volumes may actually be lower than they were pre-pandemic when you consider the increase in costs of new housing and such. In terms of other things that we're real interested in, kind of in the wake of the pandemic, is what's happening in the remote and marketplace facilitated retail arena. That's your internet sales tax, if you will. That remains strong, and it continues at about 9.5% of the total retail picture. That has been a significant increase since pre-pandemic. Although we didn't have a whole lot of data prior to the pandemic occurring, it had been hovering in about the 5.5–6% range. Now we're closer to 9 to 9.5% of our total retail is online. In terms, as you know, we did roll out a forecast at your last meeting, shared with you what we had seen in terms of the update for 2021. It represents a much larger amount of revenue than we had seen previously or in prior revenue estimates. And we are continuing to track actually closer to that new estimate than in prior estimates. This gives you a sense of it in terms of a bar graph relationship. The green line, which is pronounced in high, that was what was in the original 2006 revenue estimate for the RTA. The red line to the left of it represents our actual collections, and then each successive evaluation of our revenue estimates is shown to the right. The blue bar at the outside end is our most recent forecast, and that only shows from 2022 to the end of the life of the RTA. And we are tracking with that right now. And we continue to look at a range of forecasts as we're presenting things to you and to the board, both an optimistic, pessimistic, and a baseline forecast. And this will be used as we continue our conversations with respect to the RTA continuance. We will continue to update these revenue estimates every 2 to 3 years. And with that, I just did want to point out that if you look at in 2022 dollars, what we might see in terms of a yield for a 20-year extension of the RTA plan, it would be somewhere in the $2 to $2.3 billion range, depending upon what year we look at authorizing the extension. And with that, Madam Chair, that concludes my presentation. Be happy to answer any questions.
All right. Great. Robin, you have some questions?
Just one. I
Yeah.
noticed that the presentation was slightly different from the one that was in the materials, and would like to request a copy of the new one since it has updated information. Thank you.
Madam Chair, we'll absolutely do that, and we'll attach that to the minutes. And you will see this material reflected in the board report that comes forward for the meeting on the 27th.
And I believe, Jim, you indicated that it was a little different because you had a new collection that you didn't have when you attached the backup. Is that correct?
Yes, Madam Chair,
Okay.
we did add the January deposit to the first two graphics.
Okay, great.
First two slides. Yeah.
Thank you. All right, let's see. The next item on our agenda. Now, this is just an information item, so let me just make sure that there aren't any further questions or comments. All right, then we'll go ahead and move on to our next item, which is the cost to complete RTA projects, statutory mandates, and legal requirements. Jim, you're taking this one as well.
Yes, Madam Chair. Continuing on, this is going to be a recurring PowerPoint that you're going to see on a regular basis as we continue to go through and refine our revenue estimates and our cost estimates. Again, to remind everybody, we do have all of the RTA funding to the ballot level already programmed in the RTA fiscal 22 to 26 tip. That is what we had promised to the voters. We do have funds over and above that will be the discussion in terms of additional programming. We have not been able to make revenue or adjustments previously to the funding amount because of the impact of the Great Recession. And in fact, we needed to augment the RTA fund with the state and federal dollars that come to the region from fiscal 22, or I'm sorry, from fiscal 20 to 26 to meet the ballot obligations. When comparing the anticipated costs to complete against the current revenue projections, there is a need for additional funding. We've identified that. We know that costs have increased from 2006. We acknowledge that. We also acknowledge that there have been some unforeseen costs that are needing to be dealt with by our jurisdictional members. Those include archaeological costs on projects such as Silver Bell. Right away is certainly more expensive than it was, and we had a number of surprises on that on some of our major projects. And railroad costs are also notable and increased. We do still continue to carry in our cost estimates some costs associated with expanded scopes. We know that Sunset has an expanded scope, as does Houghton. Both of those projects, the cost estimates that we're going to be talking about carry those expanded scopes. So when we're talking about the gap, those are included. In terms of where we stand today, we have narrowed the gap somewhat. Our current range of funding needs is between 78 million and 121 million. We have been continuing to work with our jurisdictional partners on those cost estimates, and that refinement is reflected in the gap that we're showing here. We do have also committed non-RTA revenue, namely local impact fees, the remaining 1997 transportation bonds, HERF, and local general funds that also contributed, some of which have been impacted by the Great Recession as well. We do note that there are some impact fees that likely will not be realized that were promised to some projects. So that's something that will need to be part of the conversation. I do want to remind everyone that these projects are the jurisdiction's projects. They own the projects, they build the projects, they control the scope and delivery of the projects. They're responsible for the cost overruns per our administrative code and per our IGAs. However, as we have funds available, we'll certainly work with our jurisdictional partners to augment the cost or augment the funding available to the extent we have it available, and to the extent it's consistent with direction from the board and previously approved RTA plan scopes. We know that we are going to be looking for additional funds for projects. We also recognize that the lead agencies do have funds available to them that they have the option to bring to bear. They always have had, that's identified in statute and in our policies. To the extent we have RTA revenue available based upon what's coming in on our annual performance, that will be made available to the board to make decisions on how they want to distribute that. There are additional state and federal dollars that may be coming to the region. We know certainly the recent bill act will bring some increase in funding. We have yet to fully understand what that amounts to, and we are working with ADOT to try to understand that better. And that's just the formulaic distribution. There's also grants that we'll be looking for guidance on in the coming months on how to pursue some of those, which may be things that we can look at bringing to bear on these projects. Direct state allocation is always an option. We know that the state has been doing well budgetarily. We applaud the town of Marana for its efforts to bring more money to the Tangerine project, and to the extent that other jurisdictions are successful in that would be great. There is also the potential for looking at how this would work with RTA Next. And I know that's kind of confusing, and we don't want to suggest that we're laying off cost overruns to RTA Next, but there are projects that our jurisdictional partners have suggested might be bigger than what the projects were scoped in the plan. And I call to your attention potentially Harrison Road. Harrison Road in our plan is a standalone bridge over the Pantano Wash. We have heard from the community out there. We've heard from the city that there's a desire to upgrade that to a 4-lane road extending from golf links down to Irvington. That was not what was scoped in the plan, but that might make some sense to build. There is a lot of growth out in that area, and will continue to do so, continue to grow. So that may be a project that we want to look at with respect to RTA Next. And that would be a way that we would blend the two projects or two RTA elements or plans. With that, next steps, We're continuing to work with our jurisdictional partners on updates with on cost estimates. If there are scope changes that are made, we'll incorporate that and update our estimates based thereon. We would ask whether or not the RTA TMC wishes to reconstitute its project review task force to take a role in reviews. That's at your pleasure. Project features that are not eligible for RTA element or RTA funding by the state statutes, we're going to continue to identify them, and we'll need to develop a path forward on how those get dealt with. And finally, we will continue to bring to the RTA board updated revenue information so that the RTA board can determine whether or not there's revenue available to augment project funding. And with that, happy to answer any questions.
Okay, Jim, thanks for the information. I'll open the floor to questions and comments from the team. Robin?
Yes, good morning. Same question. If we could have a copy of this presentation, that would be awesome sauce. Thank you.
Madam Chair, absolutely.
Great, thanks. Jim?
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate the information, Jim. I agree, and I appreciate that you're going to be doing an ongoing update to the cost to complete. I think that's extremely important considering we're seeing some pretty substantial escalation in construction costs recently. I guess my question is, and you might not be able to answer it just because you may not have any data available, but might you have any indication in how construction costs have been escalating over the last 6 months?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Mr. Shane, I don't have a good handle on that. I'll be working with our jurisdictional partners as we see bids. As you saw, there's a lot of volatility in materials, and we've not had many recent bids to compare to. So that's really going to be what we're going to be looking at in the future, along with what our design teams come up with as they're looking at other statewide bids and estimating costs for the projects. Short answer, I don't have good information to base it on. We will be continuing to monitor that, and as we go forward, we'll make adjustments.
Great, thanks.
Other questions or comments?
Madam Chair, if I may, I just want to touch on the RTA Next discussion as an option as well. As Jim mentioned, and I'm actually glad to see that our CAC liaisons are on the call as well. As you all know, RTA Next process most likely will have an overlap with the current RTA, and I think one of the best ways that some of the board members have been describing RTA Next would be, for example, the 18th year of the current plan could potentially become the first year of the new plan. So from a timing perspective, some of these projects, like the Harrison project that Jim just mentioned, potentially would still be under design and construction in the same given year, but it just happens to be the 19th year of the current plan versus, the first year of the current plan instead of the 19th year of the old plan. So that conversation is really important for everybody to keep in mind as the CAC starts doing their planning efforts. Most likely TMC and CAC are going to be working together in tandem, trying to address some of these financial issues. And I truly believe that RTA Next is a part of that solution. From a revenue perspective, we definitely see an opportunity to look at that range that Jim described, the 78 million to 121 million. That's very manageable if you look at RTA Next as a solution, that if you have potentially 2 or 3 projects from the current plan become the first or second year of the new plan, that really takes care of that overlap and that revenue range that we're talking about. So I just want to make sure that you're aware of that discussion. Obviously, we'll continue to have that conversation with the CAC as well. But that's where the TMC comes in, and TMC can make hopefully some recommendations to the CAC as they start looking at programming the new plan.
Thank you for that clarification, Farhad. Appreciate it. Bob, you had your hand up.
Yeah, Madam Chair, along the same lines that Farhad mentioned, I just looking back at the RTA forecast history, the 2006 estimate graphic was pretty revealing as to the optimism from the acceleration of what we expected from 2016 to 2026. And certainly that hasn't been the case. I just want to mention, I'm sure we're going to look at a more conservative estimate with RTA next. And that, it's just, I think we need to be on the conservative end for what our projected revenue might be moving into the RTA next forecast. And then also just a minor thought, as technology occurs, we're looking at the cost to consider smart transportation systems that need to be accounted for probably in future roadway estimates, whether that's going to have a major cost impact or not. So I just wanted to mention that.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Bob. I think those are good observations. Can we actually pull back to that slide, Jim, where we have those that bar graph that shows
that was in the presentation on the revenues and comparison. And I'm glad you mentioned that, because there are some things that I wanted to point out on that that are, I think, relevant. That 2006 estimate, it considered natural growth in the community or population growth in the community as one of the drivers for that revenue. And I'd like to point out that when we looked at when the 2004 regional transportation plan was in place, or when it did its forecast that we used to build this from, we were estimating a population in 2025 of 1.4 million people in Pima County. That has not been realized. That is part of the reason that we're looking at that gap, because those people did not move here. They are not contributing sales taxes to our community. They're also not contributing cars and mobility needs in the community either. So that's something that I think we need to recognize when we look at the difference. We had a sea change as a result of the Great Recession.
Along those lines, Madam Chair, if I may as well. So thanks, Bob, for that comment about trying to be more conservative with the revenue estimates. As Jim mentioned earlier, based on the new information we got, we're still looking at that $2 billion to $2.3 billion. But as you start looking at programming of the next plan, there's definitely reason to believe that we don't need to program the entire $2.3 billion. So yeah, definitely you could be much more conservative and you could program at a lower estimated revenue amount as well.
Yeah, I think everyone agrees that retrospectively, we learned a lesson from the time that this was put in place back in, 2007. And we hope not to repeat that same mistake for the RTA next. So Curtis, you had your hand up.
Yes, Madam Chair, thank you. I was looking at Project 19 on the original plan, which is 22nd Street from I-10 Tucson Boulevard to Barraza. That project seems to have been lost in the dust somehow, at least the portion that runs over to I-10. And there was obviously a significant amount of money, 106 million roughly, originally slated for that project. Jim, can you tell me what's going on with that project and also what's happening with the funding associated with it?
Okay, certainly, Madam Chair, Mr. Lewick, the project itself, actually the second phase of that project, the first phase was the Keno intersection. which was completed, I believe, back in 2014. That project was to be followed by the viaduct over the Union Pacific Railroad, which will go from the Keno intersection easterly to the east end of the project. They're basically at Tucson Boulevard in that general vicinity. That project is currently in a construction manager at risk contract with the city of Tucson. So they are moving forward with that. My understanding is that in the next few months, they'll be breaking ground on it. I've not gotten any more recent information from the city. Perhaps Robin could update us on that, but that does consume most of the remaining funding. I believe there's about $10 million in that range remaining of the RTA funding commitment to apply to the later phase. It is a project that we've identified as having a gap on, and that gap would be dealt with as we move into that final phase of the project.
Okay, thank you.
Robin, you want to give us an update on that project since Curtis brought it up?
Absolutely. So as Jim stated, we are moving forward on the piece that's fully designed. And because of escalating costs and the cost of a bridge over the railroad, which is quite a lot more expensive than we initially anticipated, because the railroad will not allow any structures within their right of way, and that span length is causing some cost difficulties. In any case, it is only one piece of the cost increase conversation. The other bit is for that section between Keno and I-10, we're going to try to identify a decrease in scope and see if the potential exists to do that for a future project, because there is no funding. So we want to see if the necessary scope items are less than what is described in the RTA plan. And we're just starting that conversation now. So there's been no forward movement on any possibilities for that.
Okay, thank you.
And Madam Mayor, if I may add back to Mr. Lewick's question too. So some of these projects, as you all know, potentially are able to benefit from some federal funding as well. So initially 22nd Street was anticipated to be a federally funded project. And then during the early phases, the decision was made to not pursue federal funding on 22nd Street. And so that was a kind of an early conversation. But there's no reason to believe that some of these other projects won't qualify for federal funding, especially if there's competitive grants out there. We want to be ready as a community and have projects that are far enough along in planning stages to be able to have projects on the shelf ready to compete for those federal funds. So just want to put that out there as a list of menu of options for additional funding for projects. I'm not suggesting that any one project is better than another one to become federalized, but in general, you all know that you want to really be very focused on which projects would benefit the most from a federal funding source, and make sure that you choose projects that have the least constraints.
Just
go ahead, Robin.
To be clear, we did apply for funding for the federal funding for the bridge that is under construction now, and it was not funded through that competitive grant process. We've done that twice and been declined both times. The section between I-10 and Country Club has some sensitive areas that it seemed to be less likely to be a good candidate for federal funding. However, if we decrease the scope, that may change. So we continue to keep it on our list of potential future competitive federal grant projects.
Madam Chair, can I also add that this may be one of the projects that our project review committee looks at in some detail, hopefully able to support the city in rescoping it a little bit, because, you know, of all of our projects that have had potential for controversy, this is probably the worst, I think, as far as neighborhood objections, historic sites, and so on. So this is one where I think the technical management committee's review group can help the city move this project forward. So thank you.
We thank you for your offer, Mr. Lewick, and I'm sure we'll take up on that.
Okay, thank you.
Great. Yeah, we definitely want to take advantage of all of this infrastructure money if we can, for sure. So wherever we can support one another, I think that would be very valuable. Other questions, comments? All right. Let me pull the agenda. Okay, great. So our next item on the agenda, which is responses to requests for input on the remaining RTA projects. So Jim, this seems to be your show today. Keep going, my friend.
Okay, Madam Chair, I will do that. As we continue our conversations about the scopes of projects and the gap, if you'll recall back in September, we sent a letter out requesting that jurisdictions identify projects that they thought might be candidates for revisions to the current scope that might be able to help us bring the projects more into alignment with the funds that are available, without diminishing the functionality or the needs of the corridor. And we did get a number of responses. We presented them to you back in November. This is an opportunity to have a continuing conversation on that. The projects that were recommended for consideration were the RTA 13 First Avenue, Orange Grove Road to Ina Road project, which we received a recommendation from Pima County to eliminate and transfer the funding to Silver Bell Road. We did get a request from the city of Tucson and a detailed presentation on their recommendation to rescope First Avenue from Grant Road to River Road, from the 6-lane divided roadway that was in the RTA plan to a 4-lane divided roadway with enhanced multimodal features. And we also, again, in accompaniment with that request to downscope or eliminate the First Avenue North project, there was the request of the city to expand the scope of Silver Bell Road north of El Camino del Cerro to Ina Road, from the 2-lane roadway with a continuous left turn that was in the RTA plan to a 4-lane divided roadway. And that is a summary of the requests that we've received thus far. We've had informal conversations about a number of projects. Mr. Look, you had mentioned the 22nd Street West piece. We've had a conversation about that. We've had a conversation about Houghton North. We've had a number of conversations about other projects that we may wish to look at. Some increasing the scope, some decreasing the scope, all with the goal of meeting the current and immediately anticipated future needs. Next step would be for us to continue the conversation with the TMC and look for your recommendations and advice.
So, Madam Chair, if I may, we had a conversation with the RTA board about the input as well, and part of the conversation and the direction from the board was to obviously make sure that the technical committee has an opportunity to really look in more detail into the technical issues of these ideas and be able to hopefully compare that with the goals and objectives of the RTA plan. As Jim mentioned, we've had conversations. If you don't mind, go back to the previous slide. We've had conversations, obviously, with folks that submitted their requests, and I had conversations with both Pima County as well as City of Tucson on the list of projects that are in front of you. So they're really broken up in different categories, and if I may, I want to hopefully ask you to look at it from that perspective. So we have one project that's being proposed to be eliminated. That's the first one. So that's really a separate category by itself. That's eliminating a project. And then based on my conversations with both Chuck and Carmine, what to do with that funding is really not a technical question. That's a RTA board decision what to do with the funding. But the technical question is it a project that you would all review and recommend for eliminating? So that's one category. The other category is the reduction in scope. That's the second project. And then the third category is expansion in scope. So, and that's the third project. So you have really three different categories of what to look for and how to really vet these ideas before we can get to a recommendation. They all follow rules and obviously policies and guidelines that we have to double check and make sure that you have all the information. And I believe last time we talked about Silver Bell, and that's the most, I think, kind of a easiest one to discuss, because we have been discussing for the last almost 8 years that expansion and additional incremental costs for expansion, that's a policy issue. We need to address that separately and identify where those funds are going to come from. So again, if you would, I would say really keep the conversation in those three different categories. So maybe we can organize the conversation a little bit better by talking about elimination, expansion, reduction.
Okay, I think that's a good way to structure our conversation. So as I recall from our last discussion, and you did follow up, Farhad, one of the things that you and your team shared with us as members of this committee are, number one, the requirements of RTA in statute, okay? And you provided us with the statutory language. Number two, past practice, okay? What have previous projects in different jurisdictions done in terms of addressing, for example, an expansion in scope? What has the past practice been? Because in the interest of fairness, I think that was brought up by one of our committee members the last time around. And then lastly, of course, talking about the reduction in scope, and it might be worth summarizing some of the comments that were heard at the RTA level, the board level for us, so that we can try to address those comments specifically. And so I don't know if anybody has a preference as to which of these elimination, reduction, or expansion we want to tackle first. Excuse me.
If I may, Madam Mayor, we can give you the examples now, and then hopefully then you can kind of decide which category you want to tackle. So elimination is the easiest one. We have not eliminated any RTA projects in the 15 years history of the RTA. All corridor projects have been adhered to per the plan. So we do not have an example of any projects that have been eliminated. Expansion, we do have a couple projects that had enhancements and expansions above and beyond the scope of the project. In all those cases, RTA did not pay for the incremental cost increases. Incremental cost increases by statute are the responsibility of the lead jurisdiction. In those cases, Marana was one of them. Marana brought some local funds to the table, in addition to some additional non-RTA regional funds to complete that project. And then we had smaller expansions, not anything significant, but again, in all those cases, non-RTA dollars or local funds were used for expansions. And then reduction, the only example of reduction, and Jim can help me here, the only example of reduction that would be probably comparable to what we're talking about here would be Broadway Boulevard. Broadway went through a very extensive process, working with the community, working with the CAC that was charged in developing the alternatives analysis and recommendations that came back from the CAC on Broadway recommended reduction of the transit lanes. And obviously that project was approved by the board and it's currently under construction. I do not recall any other reduction examples unless anybody else would. Some projects might have had some minor adjustments, but we wouldn't consider those reductions per se. So those are the examples. And again, back to you, Madam Chair, if you want to take it in the order of those three categories, we'll be happy to answer any questions about any specific examples as well.
Okay, thanks,
Chair,
Farhad.
there's another example.
John, you had your hand up first.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. Just two questions on the first category of elimination. How much money, total funding, both RTA and any other, was there for that project on First Avenue, Orange Grove to Ina? And is the county saying they need none of that funding for that portion of roadway?
Yes, Mr. Bernal, the proposal from the county was to transfer all the funds from eliminating First Avenue from Orange Grove to Ina to Silver Bell Road. And I believe, and Jim is looking up the number, it's roughly how much, 7 million?
Madam Chair, the current funding amount that's within the TIP between 2022 and 2026 is $7.256 million. That consists, or that includes both RTA funds and funds from Pima County impact fee funds. Our estimate for the cost of that, which is in the gap analysis that we're talking about, is $11.2 million. So that would be an $11.2 million swing on our gap.
And Jim, what was the scope? Was it expansion to 4-lane divided or something like that?
Mr. Chair or Madam Chair, Mr. Bernal, yes, it was a 4-lane divided roadway. That was the plan. I would add that over the intervening years since the adoption of the RTA program, Pima County did go through a process in their major streets and routes plan to down plan that project from 150-foot right of way to, I don't recall whether it was a 90 or what the ultimate or where it is right now, but they did through their planning and zoning process down plan it on their major streets and routes plan.
Thank you very much.
Beth.
Sorry, trying to unmute. I had another example of a reduction. Grant Road at the UP overpass, there was a scope reduction there as well. That was supposed to get widened and there was supposed to be a new UP bridge, and that's not what the project is anymore.
I believe there was an alternative because of the cost constraints and the railroad requirements that the additional bike lanes are going to be provided off the right of way. So that I agree that's an example of a modification, but I believe the alternative to provide the bike lanes separately was the solution to that one. Jim, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Ms. Baronos, that I think is a correct characterization. The team looked at the replacement of the Union Pacific Railroad Bridge at Grant Road. They found that they could accommodate the necessary travel lanes within the existing openings. So they'll have to reconstruct underneath the railroad, the roadway prism, and then they would add a complementary bridge that would address the bicycling and pedestrian needs of the crossing, and they would do that to the south of the existing structure. So we didn't characterize it as a reduction because we saw essentially the same elements in there, but this could be one of those potato things, means how we label it. I would agree that it is a substantially less expensive project than the one that we're contemplating, and we thought it represented a very creative and innovative solution to the challenge that we had there.
Jim, can I ask for clarification? If I hear what you're saying, it was a change, it was a reduction in cost, but you're saying, well, it just sort of got the different elements in a different way, a little more creative way. But did it go through that same, what you described as extensive process with the CAC that Broadway did? Because as I recall from the presentation from the City of Tucson's project engineer at the last meeting, they described a very comprehensive process with the community, at least in the area. So kind of checked that box. What else was done for Broadway that's different? And maybe, Robin, your hand is up. Why don't you go ahead?
I just wanted to clarify two things. Our outreach for the City of Tucson's one project, the grant to River Road, was also comprehensive in that it went well outside the area of the project. So it was not confined to the area just adjacent to the project. And the other thing I just wanted to say, I think Jim misspoke saying that the Silver Bell North was a request from the city, and it was not. It was a request from the county.
Right.
So Madam Chair, if I may go back to Grant's underpass. So that was more of a technical restriction working with Union Pacific. And our understanding is that it would have been, essentially a fatal flaw if we were not able to come up with that reduction in the right of way by putting the bike lanes off the right of way. So I really don't see that one as a significant change to the scope of the project. The elements are still provided, and in many cases, actually in coordination with the Pasuyaki tribe and the city. I believe that the solution that they came up with is actually a much better solution that connects the bike lane from the roadway to the loop system as well. So and maybe Robin can talk more about where they're at with that project, but obviously there's plenty of opportunities to provide outreach on that project moving forward as well.
Let me go ahead and go to Curtis, and then Jim, you'll follow him.
Great, thank you. I'm looking at the what we promised the voters is when we talk about widening a roadway, for example, and let's use First Avenue as an example, from a 3-lane cross section to a 4-lane divided cross section. We're not just talking about adding capacity, we're talking about adding functionality, adding things for other modes, and so on. So if we're talking about eliminating or modifying projects, I think we have to look at more than just vehicular capacity and look at things that we had promised, and are we taking things away that we had promised to the voters when we modify these projects? And I'm a little bit concerned about First Avenue. Primarily, right now it's a 3-lane cross section that's got maybe 3-foot paved shoulders and so on. And to say that really there aren't any issues out there that would have been mitigated or improved with the 4-lane cross section that we no longer need, I think is a bit of a stretch. So before we throw some of these projects away, I think we should look if there's some spot improvements that need to be made, some enhancements for alternate modes, bus pullouts, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't necessarily have to be with RTA money to do this, but I think there's some expectation on these projects that something is going to happen. And if all of a sudden we are saying nothing is going to happen to these projects, I think we're going to have a lot of exposure and criticism on it. So I think we need to at least take a look at that. Again, that's something that our committee, the project review committee, could look at and just kind of open that idea up to discussion a little bit. Thanks.
Thanks,
Madam Chair, along those lines, again, we really rely on the project review committee to help us with some of those conversations moving forward. And again, I want to add the RTA next conversation as well. So some of these projects, I would say instead of talking about eliminating a project, you might want to talk about that re-scoping, as Mr. Lewick just mentioned.
Right.
But do that in the context of RTA Next, so you really do have the community's involvement and support in making those significant changes in the scope of the project.
So let me just, first of all, Curtis, you were talking more specifically about the elimination of First Avenue versus the First Avenue change. First Avenue proposal from the city of Tucson is not to not do it, but it's
Right.
to do it with a different approach, because the numbers that were originally projected back in 2005 when this is done are not materializing. And in fact, safety issues are more of a consideration there than anything else.
Yeah, right. And then I think the city is responding to the change in forecast and basically the change in need for capacity, but still providing the additional functionality for pedestrians and bicycles and transit that isn't out there today. So I think the city is making a move in the right direction, but I think to totally eliminate a project like First Avenue without providing something that had otherwise been promised to the voters, again, we've got an issue. And and again, our project review committee, as Farhad mentioned, can take a look at that and come up with some suggestions. So this gets back to my earlier comment about 22nd Street, this First Avenue project as well. We got to put ourselves, I think, a little bit in the position of the people who are going to be opposing the RTA tax extension. And remember, there was a lot of opposition back in 2006 to the original. And we've got to kind of head them off at the pass and figure out how we can still fulfill at least the functionality promise, if not the capacity promise.
Okay, I'm going to stick with the order that I had just for now, so that we'll come back to some of these conversations. So Jim, then Robin, and then Carmine. Jim?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I guess just a comment and then a question. I'm not sure if it's for Jim or Farhad, but I agree with Mr. Lewick that particularly with RTA number 14 with First Avenue, and I think I made this comment at the last TMC meeting, while there may be a justification for reducing the scope of that project from a capacity improvement, I do think it's important that other multimodal improvements that might be needed out there, particularly pedestrians, I think is one that needs to be addressed, should be evaluated and needs to be documented in a detailed analysis. Which sort of leads me to a question. Again, Farhad, maybe you're the right one to direct this to, but I'm a little unclear on the process that RTA and the TMC need to follow now in order to move these requests forwards in an appropriate fashion. The RTA number 13, First Avenue, Orange Grove to Ina. The city has done a fairly extensive technical evaluation, a public outreach assessment, talked to shareholders and property owners, and there's a lot of information there then that they, based on that evaluation and that coordination, they are making the request. So one part of my question is, now does the technical management committee, do we need to take that and evaluate it and then provide a realizing we're simply an advisory committee, but provide a recommendation that the RTA board could then act on? And then also the other two recommendations, and it sounds like the city may be moving forward with another request on 22nd Street. So for the other First Avenue project for Silver Bell, it sounds like we need to have a similar technical evaluation, maybe not to the same level as the city did on First Avenue, but a technical evaluation then that can be brought forward to this committee for review and comment, and then potentially a recommendation to the RTA board. So Farhad, can you provide us a little bit of
Sure, I'll be happy
what we need to do as a committee?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. Again, thanks to Mr. Lewick for mentioning that some of this exercise has already been assigned to the task force. They've reviewed some of these projects already, but not all of them. But that was really the charge by TMC to the project review subcommittee. So the task force, the project review task force was created for that purpose, to start looking at individual projects and then collectively come back with recommendations on how these projects are going to be delivered within budget. And if for any reason there are opportunities for any adjustments, to be able to evaluate the technical merits of those adjustments and then come back with recommendations to TMC. So that's the procedure that was created by the TMC. And again, a couple of the members of the task force are here with us today as well. And I believe they had planned on tackling some of these projects as they get closer to having more detailed technical information. So for example, and this is a conversation I had with Carmine the other day, project number 13, we may not have all the technical information just yet. That's fine, but that's on the list. They can tackle that when we have more technical information. But projects that have more information available, then they should go to work and start reviewing those documents and hopefully come back to you with a recommendation and a more vetted process on the RTA side of the process driven. Some of these projects potentially have a design concept report in place that you can go back and look at the DCR, look at the alternative analysis, and then be able to make a technical recommendation. So we're really looking for a more comprehensive view of the remaining 5 years, and not only the technical issues, but then also looking at that funding needs analysis that Jim mentioned earlier, to be able to move some of the projects forward that we're able to, and some of the projects that we may choose to recommend to move to RTA next, to have that recommendation as well from the committee.
Thanks, Farhad. I'll continue with the comments and then we'll have some more discussion. Go ahead, Robin.
Just to be absolutely clear, we concentrated at the City of Tucson very much on the functionality as we change scope. And this is about the UP at Grant, as well as the First Avenue Grant to River project. And we concluded after extensive analysis that the functionality of both of those scope changes, whether they are in any way minor, as was discussed earlier, or seemingly more major, as this slide points out. And we determined through that extensive analysis that the functionality does remain the same based on today's numbers. The other thing I wanted to ask really quickly is that going to the project review task force, or the project review task force from this committee, has the RTA number 14 been moved to that task force at this time, since we already do have the extensive information discussed?
So Madam Chair, Robin, not at this point. Obviously, that's a conversation we want to have with the TMC. And since this request was made by the TMC chair, we've been trying to compile all the suggestions and be able to have that discussion with the task force. So that is our goal, to start having the task force tackle these projects in that order. As I mentioned earlier, some of the projects we may be able to hold off and move it to the bottom of the list, and some of the projects we may be able to move to the top of the list. So that conversation needs to take place with the task force and start tackling the information that they already have available. Obviously, the more information they have, the better off they are.
Thank you, Mr. Mogimi. Madam Chair, just a quick follow-up question. I think that the members of that task force have changed recently. Can I be reminded, please, of who is on that task force currently?
The members have not changed. Unfortunately, we had one member that passed, but the members are still the same. Jim, do you have the names handy?
Yeah, Madam Chair, we have Mr. Lewick and Mr. Bernal have agreed to continue on and to serve on the or serve as co-chairs in the, with Mr. Sellis passing. Both had been previously involved, and we, I believe, are working on identifying some additional members. I believe Mr.
Thompson is on there too. Frank is out there as well.
Oh yeah, I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson and Mr. Anarino.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Carmine.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just wanted to speak to the county's recommendation, and I've heard some switching of whether RTA number 13 or number 14 was the county segment. So it is RTA number 13, First Avenue, Orange Grove to Ina Road. And in terms of that recommendation, I just wanted to put it in context that when the Technical Management Committee asked for input, that was done on a very short time frame. So it came out of a meeting on September 10th. The request was to submit input by September 21st, and the county's request from Mr. Huckleberry came in on October 1st. So admittedly, and obviously, we didn't do a detailed analysis here. The city's project on First Avenue, RTA number 14, that effort did not initiate and get completed within the time frame when the ask was made by the Technical Management Committee and when the recommendation was submitted. The look that the county did on the Orange Grove to Ina Road segment was based on the traffic volume forecast and the capacity of the current roadway section being adequate for those forecasted volumes. And I know that at the last Technical Management Committee, there were questions asked or suggestions made that the elements that were not roadway related, but the bike lanes and the sidewalks should be considered for construction, right, to move forward. So on that project, I would suggest that we're welcoming of input from the Plan Review Committee. And in terms of detailed information, there's not a whole lot more that we're going to offer in at this point in terms of a reasoning for not widening the roadway. Now, if there is an interest in maintaining some of those non-roadway elements, we're happy to have that conversation with RTA staff and with the Technical Management Committee and the Plan Review Subcommittee on what those elements should be to try and get to a revised scope that's more reflective of what is desired. So we can continue that. The project element on RTA number 5 on Silverbell Road, and that's Del Cerro to Ina Road. That one is one where the 2045 traffic volume forecasts will not be met by the proposed roadway cross section. And it was recommended then taking the First Avenue funds and moving it over to that project, and then also building out a 4-lane segment for that. That leg of that project has both Pima County and the town of Marana. So if there is more detailed preparation of information that is needed before the Plan Review Committee can look at that, we're happy to get together again with RTA staff, with the town of Marana, and scope out what that additional needed information is to bring that forward. So, from our perspective, it could be that the First Avenue Orange Grove to Ina Road segment has enough detail, at least for the Plan Review Committee to say, okay, based on capacity, we acknowledge that the widening out to 4 lanes is not required. However, we think that these off-road elements are important, and let's come up with, provide us with an estimate on on what those costs may be. And then we can also then work with RTA staff and with the plan review subcommittee to identify what the details would be that are needed on the scope change for Silver Bell Road. So I just wanted to indicate to that in terms of our input, it was not done via an extensive analysis. It was within an 11-day or maybe a little bit longer period of time, over a couple of weeks of time, that we responded to that request for input.
Okay, thanks, Carmine. Tim?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So I'm just trying to get my arms around the process. And I'm admittedly not as familiar with all of the subcommittees of this work, but I'm trying to digest what I'm hearing today and figure out what the next step is for all three projects, but certainly for RTA number 14, the city's request. I believe that the city has submitted sufficient information for the review to occur, whatever the next step is. And so my question is it moving to the review committee, and when does the review committee meet? Or do you need a motion in order to move that project or all three projects to the review committee?
So thank you, Madam Chair. Tim, yes, the management committee formed the task force to look at all projects in the remaining 5 years. And as part of this exercise, we wanted to generate a list of ideas, and these are the only three we have so far. We may have more ideas, like Mr. Lewick mentioned, 22nd Street might be one of them. So they are tasked to look at all remaining projects, and all these three projects will move forward to the task force. And any additional ideas that come from the technical management committee can also be added to their list. Again, the only point we wanted to make was that to make sure that they can efficiently move forward, to prioritize which projects have the most information available and start with those projects. And as Carmine just mentioned, for example, project number 13, they may have that conversation, but since we don't have all the information, that may be on the bottom of the list, not on top of the list. So we'll let them have their conversation, and then they may even come back and ask for additional information. So number 13 is a good example that they may review it and say, we really need more information to discuss this one. Please provide X, Y, and Z for us so we can continue that conversation. But again, the short answer is yes, they are going to review all three projects so far, and any other projects that are going to come to the table by the technical management committee, we can forward it to the task force and have them start looking at those in that fashion.
And when is that task force meeting? Farhad?
We'll schedule a meeting as soon as we're done with this meeting. We'll coordinate with the task force and schedule a meeting.
Okay, so
Thank you, Madam
the answer is no motion necessary. It's automatically going, and you'll get something scheduled here in the near future.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
You bet, Tim. Thanks. Kurt.
Yes, just one quick request, Madam Chair and Farhad. If we could obtain from ADOT a very detailed schedule of their forthcoming I-10 improvements. This is certainly going to affect Silver Bell, and it may possibly have an effect on First Avenue as well. There's going to be again, another couple of years of construction on I-10. Sunset is going to be closed for a while. We're going to see diversion of traffic. And it would be helpful to our project review committee to have a good sense of what's going to be happening along I-10 over the next 2 or 3 years. So thank you.
Sure, we'll be happy to do that. And Mr. Lane is on the call too, if he wants to add anything to that. But he's been working closely with all of our members to coordinate I-10 improvements as well.
Go ahead, Rod.
So thank you, Farhad, Mr. Chair. Mr. Lewick, are you looking for something beyond the design concept report for the I-10 SR 210 study? Are you looking for something more in the north?
Yeah, we're looking for Rod, for the section north of El Camino del Cerro, basically north of El Camino del Cerro to Ina, for that widening. That's what I'm particularly concerned about, because that's going to have a huge effect on Silver Bell operation, and could potentially have an effect on First Avenue as well.
Okay, I can give you a little bit of detail now in that. I mean, we've got the GAP project is in design right
Mhm.
now, and that's the section of I-10 that's going through between the Ina and the Ruthroff one. We expect
Right.
to have that one out for construction within this fiscal year, is what the funding is for in fiscal year 22. Beyond that, and that also includes the Sunset TI reconstruction as well. So are you looking for anything more beyond that?
Well, yeah, if you had a calendar of events, when you would anticipate the Sunset TI to be closed, if ramps are going to be open, and so on, so that when we're particularly reviewing Silver Bell, we've got a sense of the interrelationship between those two projects, and whether or not we need to somehow advance some spot improvements on Silver Bell to facilitate the traffic diversion that's going to happen because of the GAP project. So that's kind of where I'm headed, Rod.
Okay, sure, we can do that. Those types of functions usually occur naturally with the coordination of the teams. We've got all parties, the city and the county, very involved in both of those projects because they've both got quite a bit of involvement in them.
Sure.
So they typically take place at the county level. Are we looking for some kind of a presentation to this committee, or are we looking for something to go to the task force?
No, I think we just need a schedule to go to the task force.
Sure,
That's
absolutely.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Okay, great. So,
If I may, I was just going to say, we'll be happy to coordinate with Mr. Lane and make sure the task force has all the information they need.
okay, great. Thanks, Farhad. One thing that I wanted to comment on that I heard from Farhad that I think is worth our conversation, maybe digging just a tad deeper, which is we've been talking about the potential of an overlap between RTA and RTA Next. Of course, it all depends on a lot, naturally. Whether or not it moves forward, whether or not it goes on a ballot, whether or not it gets approved by the voters, all of those different things. And I think that there has always been conversation about trying to get something before voters in 2024, by 2024, so that we would know, right, because it expires in 2026, whether or not we need to pivot, and then looking at that. So this is 2022. We know a couple things. Number one, we don't have enough money to do all the projects on the list anyway. We just don't. So, so I think that maybe on this slide, as an example, recommending the elimination of a project, I think maybe in Farhad's comments, maybe it's not we eliminate it, it's just that we push it to the next. Because right now it's not warranted, right? We don't want to, we talked about this at our last management TMC meeting, which was, what do our residents expect out of us? They expect good government, right? That we don't just build something because we said we would, if in fact it's not warranted. I think that's part of our responsibility, which is if there's a better solution that meets what is today actual 15, 16 years later versus what we thought was going to exist, we need to respond to it. Our community expects us to respond to it. And so if RTA number 13, the First Avenue from Orange Grove North is not needed right now, that widening doesn't mean that it may not be needed in 20 years, right? We don't know what's going to happen. Maybe it still stays on the list, but it's just, it doesn't quite meet for now. And so, I'd like to maybe suggest that. The other thing I want to spend just a minute talking about, if you all don't mind, is RTA number 5, Silver Bell. I'm all for making sure that what we build is what is needed, okay? But I think we need to have a pretty, an honest conversation here about well, first of all, what does the law say? And I think that's important. And number two, what's fair? Okay. What has happened in previous projects where things have gotten, wider? Is this project, Silver Bell Road, something that we also want to say, you know what, let's just put that into RTA next and then go ahead and make it a 4-lane and have it all paid for out of RTA? Or is it, and just continue with the scoping right now and get it all designed and ready to go? Maybe there's some infrastructure money that we can throw, you know, in that way. Or do we, you know, ask the Pima County and Marana to get together and say, do y'all have any, you know, additional resources that you can throw at it so that we can get it started right now? Because I mean, I know that Oro Valley, we've had to reduce scope, and we've all had to reduce scopes of projects, right? We've all had to come up with more money over the past 15 years because we haven't had enough money available in RTA. And so, you know, those, I guess I've kind of rambled on a little bit to give you my personal thoughts and maybe generate some discussion on this to see, you know, are we, and to give this, if all 3 of these projects are going to go to the task force, I'd like them to also consider these matters as well. Requirements, fairness, good government, and you know, changes in demand, you know, just like was mentioned before, population isn't materializing. A lot of things aren't materializing the way that we had intended. So I will stop now and open it up for conversation from the rest of the committee members. Because I don't want to be the last one to say something on this. Go ahead, Carmen.
Madam Chair, I just comment that the, you know, recommendations that you made to consider other options than have been discussed, right, is a good one. And I think we would welcome that again. Our offering of input was really an idea for a conversation, not an end to all of it by saying approve this or don't approve it. So I think that the nature of questions that you raised would be appropriate for the Plan Review Task Force to consider as part of their review of these projects.
Thanks, Carmen. Other comments or further discussion on this? Bob?
Yeah, Madam Chair, along the same lines, I mean, I don't want to drill down in specifics on First Avenue, Grant to River, but in my mind, I know that the bridge over the Rito is 60 some years old, but is that one, if it is still stable and been assessed, is that a particular item that could be moved into RTA next? It just depends on, you know, that's a big dollar amount. I think it's in the estimate. Does it merit consideration of doing that? With all due respect as to the safety required for that bridge, but you know, can it last another 15 years of service life? It's my thought. And we start thinking outside the box on that.
Madam Chair, if I may add, thanks, Bob. I mean, that's an example of an opportunity to even pursue federal grant funding. We may be able to be very competitive to pursue just funding for the bridge replacement if those categories are going to be moving forward as we believe they are. So we really want the task force to look at it from that perspective and come back with those list of recommendations for those type of opportunities to bring more funding to the region.
Robin?
Just to be completely clear, our feasibility study did look into the longevity of that bridge. And so that's spelled out very clearly, and it's not really 15 years. But I do agree that it is not a good idea to assume that no other funding sources can be brought to bear, and where we have opportunities, we should look to applying for them. There is a difficulty, however, if we put too many projects on the list for federal grants, then ultimately we may not get any of them. And so we have to sort of narrow down our priorities in order to ensure success.
Yeah, very wise, Robin. You're right. We don't want to throw spaghetti up at the wall. We want to go in with a targeted, strategic approach to it. Curtis?
Madam Chair, speaking of targeting and strategic, I think probably the first thing our project review team is going to have to do is come up with a protocol for evaluating these revised projects, because it's different than what we did before. Before we were kind of looking at specifically what we promised the voters and what the agencies were delivering, what RTA was funding, what the agencies were funding, and so on. So I think we're going to have to sit down, scratch our heads a little bit as we look at these remaining projects and potential major revisions, eliminations, and so on. And I can't speak for John Bernal, but as one of the co-chairs, I'm very anxious to start looking into these projects because the clock is ticking. And if we can get the project review done within the next 3 months or so for these several projects, and if we're going to add a couple of other, I think it's probably doable and aggressive to do that. But I don't want this to certainly delay and get into the summer session and so on. We already have COVID issues to deal with for the committee getting together. The easy logistics of rolling out a plan set and looking at it, I think are going to be a little bit more difficult for us to do this time around. So I guess Farhad, the sooner that you can charge our review committee up and get us going, the happier we all will be, and we can move all these issues forward to some kind of logical conclusion.
Thank you, Mr. Lewick. Definitely will provide all resources you need, and we're available to hopefully get the group together here as soon as you're all ready. So thank you for your willingness to participate, and Bernal as well. We do recognize that as part of your first meeting, you would want to kind of create some kind of a list of priorities and criteria. So we'll discuss that to include it on your agenda.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. And I might add, I agree, and also want to thank Curtis and John for what I know is going to be a lot of hard work. So get ready. I'm sure you have nothing else to do these days. But, the presentation that, just as an example, the City of Tucson's contractor made, and Tucson, on the First Avenue project last time around, their outreach was very extensive. And I, for one, am not in favor of duplication. Okay, so let's really take a look at what's necessary. I understand there was a process with Broadway and how that went, but can we take a look at what was done for Broadway is what already has been done by the City of Tucson? Can it check many of those boxes so that we don't waste time and duplicate work? To me, that's the hallmark of bad government, is if we're just doing things over and over again. My 2 cents. So Tim?
Thank you, Chair. And you actually covered some of my comments. So I appreciate what you just said, because I do believe that this project is, the work's been done. We're hopeful for a speedy and timely review. And I did want to also thank Mr. Lewick and Mr. Bernal for their willingness to take on, and Mr. Lewick for setting, whether you meant to make a commitment of 3 months or not, that's what I heard. So we do appreciate it, because I think it's important that we keep momentum going, and especially when you have a lot of analysis and outreach that is behind a proposal, then I'm sure that'll be taken into consideration. But it was mostly just to weigh in and say thank you. We do appreciate what you're bringing to the table and what you're attempting to take on.
Tim, can I assume that the City of Tucson will make your contractors available to the subcommittee for any specific additional information or participation in those committee meetings as needed?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, great, thanks. So here's what I just to summarize our conversation here and make sure we're all on the same page. These 3 items are going to, among other potential ideas that may go to the project subcommittee that will be chaired by Curtis and John, co-chaired by Curtis and John. And you all are going to dig into deeper all of these projects and be prepared to make some recommendations on what those are. I assume at that point, those recommendations then come back to this group. Is that fair, Farhad?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
It is your subcommittee, so they report to the TMC.
Okay, great. So the subcommittee is going to get to work over the next couple of months and bring back those recommendations to this body in the, let's call it, the not too distant future. And then at that point, this group will then review their recommendations and be prepared to make a recommendation, a formal recommendation to the RTC board for their approval. We talked about kind of a framework, and I won't reiterate some of the things that we talked about, the possibility of maybe not necessarily eliminating, but maybe pushing things into the next. We talked about other funding sources. We talked about adjusting scope, and we also talked about not duplicating effort. I think some of those are kind of the framework of what it is that that the group is going to be doing. I certainly am happy to offer any support or that the town of Oro Valley can offer to the subcommittee if you need it. We're here to support. This is a big effort. We're all trying to get to the same place. I really appreciate the great ideas personally, and frankly, the very productive conversation and discussion we've had today. So does that about sum it up? All right, I see at least one thumbs up. I'm going to take that as a consensus. Thanks, Tim. Okay, great. I believe that is our last item on the agenda. So with that, I don't know that we necessarily need a motion to adjourn, but I'll go ahead and entertain one anyway.
And make that motion.
Hey, I don't care. Beth made a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All right, second by Bob. Thank you all again for your great discussion. All those in favor of adjourning signify by saying aye.
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 All opposed? All right, we are adjourned, ladies and gentlemen. Have a great day.
Thank you.
All right,
you.
bye.